So I wanted to talk about NSPM-7, the National Security Presidential Memo that was issued on September 25th of 2025 and is essentially the presidential instruction on what the national security priorities are going to be for the next year, or, well, for at least the next year. Um, so the Trump regime released this memo. And really, this moment in US politics is not about like crime or protests or even terrorism. It's about who gets to define danger and what tools the government can use against it and against those that they choose to label as a threat. So, NSPM 7, which was titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, offers a window into how a democratically elected government can begin to look and act more like an authoritarian regime while still speaking the language of law and order. So, authoritarian projects rarely start by openly attacking the public as a whole. Instead, they construct a permanent internal enemy, the enemy from within, some group said to be disloyal, dangerous, and fundamentally opposed to the nation's values. In NSPM 7, that role is assigned to a broad variety of anti fascists and left leaning movements and beliefs. In the case of protesters, for example, they are not described simply as citizens who sometimes break the law. They are portrayed as anti American, anti Christian, anti capitalist, and hostile to, quote, traditional family, race, and gender views. Now, this framing matters. It is powerful because it fuses belief and identity with violence. If anti fascism itself is cast as a gateway to terrorism, then anyone who shares even some of those views can be painted as a potential terrorist. A heated protest, a harsh tweet, a radical campus talk, things that in a democracy usually count as protected speech, can be more easily folded into a story about a coordinated campaign of domestic terror. Once that narrative takes hold, every instance of unrest looks less like politics and more like proof that the internal enemy is real. Modern democracies, such as the US, often grant their governments extra powers in moments of crisis, such as war, large-scale terrorism, or insurrection. The danger comes when those powers stop being temporary exceptions and start to become tools of everyday governance. NSPM 7 takes the logic of the post 9/11 war on terror and grafts it onto domestic politics. It treats organized political violence not as a set of specific crimes to prosecute, but as a national security problem requiring a comprehensive strategy run through terrorism task forces and the security apparatus. This shift matters because tools designed for extraordinary threats, such as intelligence-style surveillance, wide-ranging financial investigations, and network mapping, can now be deployed inside the country against groups linked even loosely to protest and dissent. It also relocates decision-making away from local institutions and courts towards a more secretive, national security-oriented bureaucracy that historically operates with less transparency and weaker democratic oversight. So what begins as an exception justified by crisis starts to look like the new normal. And authoritarian and totalitarian leaning systems depend on concentrating power in the hands of the executive, the president, prime minister, party leader, or ruling clique. NSPM 7 moves in this direction by placing the president and the attorney general at the center of the domestic terrorism apparatus. Federal terrorism task forces are ordered to follow a national strategy and report up the chain. Agencies such as Treasury and the IRS are instructed to use their tools against the same targets. And the Attorney General is empowered to recommend that specific domestic groups be designated as terrorist organizations. Now, in a healthy constitutional system, law enforcement and prosecutorial powers are buffered by clear laws, independent courts, and some distance from day-to-day politics. When the line between political opponent and security threat depends largely on how the executive branch characterizes a movement, those buffers erode. A protest could be treated one day as a routine civil disobedience and the next as part of a terror network, depending less on the facts than the administration's political agenda. The kind of discretionary power is exactly what authoritarian leaders need to reward allies, punish enemies, and keep everyone uncertain about what it is safe to say or do. As I said, most authoritarian governments do not begin by openly abolishing free speech. Instead, they redefine certain forms of speech and association as inherently dangerous. Incitement, extremism, terrorism, and insist that they are targeting violence, not opinions. But NSPM-7 moves in this direction by wrapping a wide range of conduct and expression into its picture of organized political violence. Doxing, harassment, riots, trespass, civil disorder, and online radicalization are portrayed as elements of a coordinated terror ecosystem rather than as separate, often already illegal acts. Once that ecosystem is defined, the state can act against it indirectly. Banks are asked to report suspicious financial flows. The IRS is told to scrutinize nonprofits that indirectly, quote unquote, support political violence. And law enforcement is urged to question suspects about organizers and fundraisers as a matter of course. None of this formally bans a slogan, ideology, or social movement, yet the chilling effect is clear. Activists may pull back from criticizing police, capitalism, or U.S. foreign policy if those ideas are routinely linked to terrorism in official rhetoric. Donors and foundations may decide that supporting protest movements is simply too risky. Even universities and cultural institutions may quietly avoid controversial speakers or research that could be portrayed as sympathetic to extremism. The legal right to speak may remain on paper, but the real-world cost of exercising that right rises sharply for anyone outside of the accepted ideological mainstream. This is how free speech withers without a single formal repeal of constitutional protections. Totalitarianism, in its classic sense, is not just about censorship or repression. It is about reshaping society so that nearly every institution, schools, media, courts, the economy, even private life, serves a single political project. NSPM-7 alone does not create such a system, but it lays down some of the rails on which more openly totalitarian trains could later run. By defining a broad, ideologically marked internal enemy, by embedding national security tools in domestic political management, and by concentrating discretion in the executive, the memorandum builds a framework that future leaders can exploit. A restrained administration might use it narrowly. A more aggressive one could use it to investigate journalists, blacklist organizations, strip nonprofits of tax status, and pressure critics, all while insisting it's only fighting terrorism. The real danger is not just the abuses that happen immediately, but the way this kind of policy shifts the baseline. Over time, a level of surveillance, control, and fear that once would have looked shocking can start to feel normal. When a government merges the language of war and terror with domestic politics and reserves for itself the power to decide who counts as a terrorist, it is not merely fighting crime. It is rewriting the rules of political life in a way that brings the country closer to authoritarian rule, even if elections continue and familiar institutions remain in place. That's how they steal democracy.